Yes.
The Leaf Spring Army sends its regards.
Hello, everyone. I'm the Enforcer, and I'm accompanied by Enforcer Matt.
And good evening, folks. It's Enforcer Matt, and welcome back to day 1463 of the War News stream. And Iran is making a very bad move as of today. We are hearing that U.S. officials are now warning that Iran has begun rebuilding their nuclear weapons program from the ground up, which is obviously a pretty bad red line to cross. We've also heard that Russia is preparing a radiation disaster in Ukraine, according to analysts. And also another massive one, Cuba has now fired on a U.S. boat near the Cuban coast, killing 4 citizens on board the boat. And we have a lot of details about that whole situation. It's a pretty big one, and it's good to see you all once again.
And of course, we're going to be covering the past 24 hours of the news from around the world, as we have been able to hear significant developments from the Middle East, Eastern Europe, East Asia, Central Asia, Western Europe, the central area of the Americas, and also the United States of America over the course of the day. We have been able to hear the credible intelligence and information provided by U.S. intelligence forces to the United States of America's government and have been able to confirm that the Islamic Republic of Iran is working on restarting their nuclear program and starting widespread uranium enrichment throughout the entirety of the country, clearly in violation of the attempts at the pieces that have been made inside of Muscat, Oman, and Geneva, Switzerland, over the denuclearization of the Islamic Republic of Iran. We have been able to see that significant tunnel works operations are still undergoing at Pickaxe Mountain, and we've also been able to hear that apparently the Islamic Republic of Iran is also working on helping to prepare other facilities, either for the upcoming attacks by the United States, clearly showing that nuclear activities are still being conducted within those facilities, or they clearly have a significant amount of activity around the area, which also once again shows that the Islamic Republic of Iran is clearly working on restarting their nuclear weapons program at full speed and scale like it had been 8 months ago. Although I do have to make it incredibly clear that their nuclear program had been working to a minimal speed over the past 8 months due to the fact that the Pickaxe Mountain uranium enrichment facility had stood completely intact over the entirety of the past few months from Pickaxe Mountain to now. Oh, more so Midnight Hammer to now. We've also been able to additionally hear that all U.S. naval forces based out of the U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet headquarters within Bahrain at the naval station have broken out into the open sea as of today, meaning that as far as vulnerable U.S. forces that would be trapped in the Persian Gulf if a war began, generally is not the case any longer, and that also means that strikes by the United States could begin at any moment now, once again. We have been able to also note that 250 combat aircraft of the United States Armed Forces are currently present throughout the entirety of the Middle East, which is a significant grouping of U.S. combat air power. Largely around 20 to 25% of all combat aviation aircraft of the United States Air Force are currently inside the Middle East at this moment, with even a larger amount now appearing to be present within the state of Israel, all the way from Tel Aviv and all the way down to the most southerly base inside of Israel, the Ovda Air Base, just north of the port of Eilat. Further on than that, we have been able to hear that the United States has been making significant statements today through the Office of the Secretary of State, along with many others, once again showing that largely the entire government is on board with the strikes that are coming up soon against the Islamic Republic of Iran. We've actually been able to see that there has been a fairly decent bipartisan push within both houses, well, in both parties in Congress, to be able to move forward with strikes, as after confidential briefings and information has been provided to members of the Congress, it now appears that they believe that military strikes against the Islamic Republic of Iran are a national imperative and a national prerogative due to the significant national security risk that the Iranians are currently posing to the United States of America and U.S. interests inside the Middle East. However, negotiations will be happening tomorrow with the Iranians nonetheless. But every statement from the United States and about every single statement from the Iranians is making it incredibly clear that these talks might just be to buy a tiny bit more time before the U.S. decides to begin strikes. We've also been able to see that the Islamic Republic of Iran's government has apparently been getting incredibly concerned, and now all of the top officials of the Islamic Republic of Iran are apparently having to meet with Khamenei inside of an unknown bunker within an unknown location, blindfolded. They are taken by private guards of Khamenei's bodyguard detail, blindfolded, and then driven to an undisclosed location to where they walk him into a bunker, sit him down in front of Khamenei, and then keep the blindfold on them the entire time that they're meeting. I'm not even making that up. That's actually what they're doing.
I would hate to be the driver for that situation. They're going to be the first ones getting blamed if his location ever gets leaked. That would be a bad spot to be in.
Yeah, that would be a pretty rough one, to say the least. We've also been able to hear down at Diego Garcia that it does appear that there is still more significant buildups that are happening of U.S. Armed Forces within the area, as a couple of F-16CMs, the ones that we were looking for, have actually been spotted on the tarmac by satellite at Diego Garcia. We've also been able to hear in other news around the world and heading towards Cuba that a U.S. vessel today has been fired upon by the U.S. Coast Guard, resulting in the deaths of 4 U.S. citizens and apparently 6 others being wounded, which have now been taken in custody by the Cuban government and are apparently being treated inside of Cuba. I don't really know what kind of medical treatment they can provide in Cuba, but I would assume that it's fairly limited. Nevertheless, the Cuban government has made a statement that they found bombs, explosives, assault rifles, high-powered optics, camouflage, I believe some other forms of advanced optics as well, and a whole bunch of other equipment on board this vessel, which appears to be indicating that it was some sort of a plan to conduct possibly a covert operation in Cuba, although we're not entirely sure about that, and we're still trying to get more information on that here at this moment. We've also been able to see that the war between the Mexican government and the Jalisco New Generation Cartel has continued, and we have now heard that the cartel has issued a new demand that the body of El Mencho must be released. I believe it was at 1 p.m. tomorrow. Otherwise, they are going to start executing government officials and civilians at large across the entirety of the central area of the country, which is currently under the Jalisco Cartel's control. We have seen that in the meantime, the National Guard and Army of Mexico have been conducting significant actions against the cartel, with a major battle and firefight breaking out in the smaller city of Tuxpan today within the Jalisco state. We've also been able to hear of other larger militant actions that have been ongoing between the Jalisco Cartel and the National Guard and Army of Mexico, but we have not been able to cover those largely over the course of this day, once again due to the high frequency and coverage of news that we have to have over the course of this day specifically. We've also been able to hear that Kim Yo-jong, the sister of Kim Jong-un, has lobbed a fairly significant statement at South Korea today, stating that the South Korean government is in the process of collapse, and they may have to conduct some form of arbitrary action, largely insinuating some form of a conventional armed invasion of South Korea here within the near future. These sorts of threats have been fairly rare over prior years. Usually it's something along the lines of nuclear hellfire or making people suffer or something along those lines. This time it's an actual armed invasion, which is a fairly interesting change in their foreign policy and their rhetoric against South Korea. Moving on from that, we've also been able to see that the Russian Federation, according to the Institute for the Study of War, is now preparing to create some sort of a radiological incident inside of Ukraine and then blame the Ukrainians as a result of that for conducting some form of an undisclosed nuclear weapons test or something else along those lines, which will allow the Russian Federation the proper groundwork to be able to start using tactical nuclear weaponry or more increased actions and escalatory steps against the state of Ukraine in the current conflict, which is not going all that well for the Russians. The Russian Federation has lost more ground today, and currently we do not hear of the Russian Federation making any gains on any front line currently. If anything, they are able to hold their lines in some areas, but in other directions, like specifically within the Zaporizhia front, the Kupiansk front, and the Pokrovsk front, it actually appears that the Ukrainians are able to push them back little by little, day over day at this point, which is once again putting the ball largely back in Ukraine's court. We also saw that a major drone attack was conducted on the Russian Federation today, with explosions being reported within Sevastopol and also the city of Saki within the northern and central region of Crimea. And we've also been able to hear that more so security camera footage has actually come out today of the Flamingo cruise missile, the first ever confirmed footage that we have of it, slamming into the missile production facility at Votkins. We have all of that news and a whole bunch more to get to over the course of this day. And we are, of course, folks, going to be making sure to get into this news, starting with our largest stories first and then working our way on down into the smaller stories throughout the night. And I have to say that while I say that every night, it is the case tonight that there is really no lacking of large stories. We have nothing but large stories to cover tonight with a lot of additional details to add on to each one. So please make sure to stick around through the whole stream because it's going to take a little bit to get through some of our first major topics, but there's still larger ones to come after that. Moving us on into our first and largest news of the day, we have been able to hear that the U.S. government has started to make clear statements today that intelligence has confirmed and does prove that the Islamic Republic of Iran is working on restarting their nuclear program in full force. To give you all a little bit of an outline of what we've known so far and what we're currently working off of right now in the information sphere, the Islamic Republic of Iran came under a significant attack by the United States Armed Forces on the midsummer of last year on an operation that was called Operation Midnight Hammer. Midnight Hammer was largely a one-night operation, generally comprised of B-2 bombers dropping GBU MOPS, or GBU, I believe it's 51 MOPS, if I'm not mistaken, or something. Wait, hang on. A GBU-54, that is what it is, a GBU-54 MOP on multiple Iranian facilities throughout the country. These included the Qom Uranium Enrichment Facility, the Natanz Uranium Enrichment Facility, and also a Tomahawk cruise missile attack on the Nuclear Research and Development Campus at Isfahan. Those were generally the three main targets of that U.S. attack at that time. We had also seen that during the 12-day war, the state of Israel had conducted significant attacks against other key Iranian nuclear development facilities, including the plutonium research reactor at Iraq, or more so the uranium research reactor at Iraq, which produced weapons-grade uranium, and also the nuclear research and development campus at Parchin, just southeast of Tehran. From what we understand, the damage was pretty decent, but it was not enough to completely destroy Iran's nuclear enrichment and nuclear development capabilities. Most importantly, one of the larger failings that we saw of that operation actually occurred just near to the area of the Natanz uranium enrichment plant, which is this one right here. Right after the attack was conducted, it was then discovered that just south of that, there was a large mountain complex that appears to be comprised of 4 main tunnels that also appears to be conducting some form of uranium enrichment. This facility was completely missed during Midnight Hammer and was not hit by any U.S. airstrikes during that time. Right after the strikes concluded, the President of the United States claimed that the damage had been absolute and that the Iranians would never be able to produce a nuclear weapon again within years. About 6 months later, or more so 8 months later, we are right back to the fact that the Islamic Republic of Iran not only has an intact uranium enrichment facility in the form of Pickaxe Mountain right here, but they're also trying to restart their uranium enrichment at multiple other facilities throughout the country, including the Qom Uranium Enrichment Facility, the Isfahan Research Campus, and even the Natanz Uranium Enrichment Plant that we generally knew of prior to the strikes that is right here just north of the Pickaxe Mountain facility. It does appear that at the moment, The U.S. government has made a great deal of statements on this, and I'll be getting y'all through a couple of the major ones that we got over the course of the day. We have been able to hear that some U.S. analysts are stating, including it appears to be Rubio, that we're going to be most likely bombing Iran within the near future. We've also been able to hear that apparently, according to additional statements that were made by the vice president today, the vice president stated, and this was direct words out of a quote, "We have detected evidence that Iran is attempting to resume the development of nuclear weapons." So it does appear that quite obviously, multiple government officials in the U.S. government have made it wildly clear that the Islamic Republic of Iran is working on the development of nuclear weaponry once again. We've generally known about that for a while. We've also known that the Iranians, making it incredibly clear in their talks in Muscat, Oman, and in Geneva, Switzerland, have made it wildly evident to the United States that they're not willing to make any compromise on their ability to enrich uranium. Both in Muscat, Oman, and also in Geneva, Switzerland, they made it incredibly clear they were not going to be limiting their uranium enrichment whatsoever. They also made that incredibly clear last year, prior to Operation Midnight Hammer, to U.S. negotiation teams, that they were not going to be negotiating on the limitation of uranium enrichment capabilities inside of the Islamic Republic of Iran. This has given us a clear indication that they are working on nuclear programs and nuclear materials within the country, and there's another important point that I have to make sure to indicate to everyone here at the beginning of the show, which is a telltale sign that they're still working on something. If the Iranians were working on nothing, what would it hurt them to just go ahead and agree to a United States treaty that states that they will not develop a nuclear weapon? What would the harm in that be? Now, this is before we get to all of the evidence on the ground here that they actually are still working on the development of a nuclear weapon. But if we speak to ourselves honestly here, if Iran is not developing a nuclear weapon, and all of this is a lie, then why in the world will Iran not simply agree to a treaty with the United States that states that they won't develop a nuclear weapon because they already aren't? If that was the case, that would be easy as punch. They would have already done that in Muscat, Oman a couple of weeks ago. As a matter of fact, they would have done that about 8 months ago. Clearly, they're working on a nuclear weapon. That's the reason why they don't want to agree to this, because if they agree to this treaty, that means that U.S. inspectors would be allowed into the country, and they would clearly uncover the fact that they're still working on nuclear weapons development, which is generally the reason why they're not willing to agree to any of these treaties. Additionally, we've also been able to see that all of the other nuclear facilities in the country, like the Qom Uranium Enrichment Plant and the Isfahan Research Campus, are having their entrances covered in hundreds of feet, that is hundreds of feet from the entrance and several dozens of feet thick from the top of soil to be able to stop U.S. Special Forces teams from being able to make it to the facilities, enter the facilities, and go into them. Now, if Iran was not developing nuclear weaponry, why in the world would they be trying so hard to stop the U.S. Armed Forces, if a war begins, from going into these facilities, which the Iranians allege are not involved in nuclear weapons development whatsoever, and do whatever they want in them? If the U.S. Special Forces arrived and the Iranians were speaking the truth here, it would be quite obvious and evident to the Special Forces teams once they arrived that these tunnels were absolutely empty of anything that could produce a nuclear weapon. As a matter of fact, those tunnels might not even be involved in any operations with the nuclear program. And that's not the case. And that's why the Iranian government is currently working to try and completely close off those tunnels so that way no ground forces, like our special forces, can go into those tunnels and meddle with the nuclear equipment and the nuclear technology and developments that they've made that are currently housed and stored inside of those tunnels. We've also been able to hear an even more damning statement today from the U.S. intelligence that it does appear that satellite imagery has indicated that work on a tunnel network beneath Pickaxe Mountain is still ongoing at this moment. This is the facility right here, and from what we understand, satellites are apparently tracking that the larger ballast or tailings piles that are directly outside of the tunnel entrances appear to be growing slowly, about a couple of truckloads per day, which appears to show that the Iranians are actually boring even deeper into Pickaxe Mountain and expanding the usable amount of floor room within this area for them to be able to use for their nuclear research and development. This is once again clearly showing us that they are still working on nuclear technologies and nuclear development. The Qom Uranium Enrichment Plant, which has an almost identical footprint to the entire Natanz nuclear facility campus, including the subterranean complex, is exactly identical. And we had clear confirmation when Midnight Hammer was conducted that this facility, just north right here, was also being used to house uranium enrichment centrifuges and to be able to try and create weapons-grade uranium for the Iranian nuclear weapons program. So it is quite obvious at this point that the Iranians are still working on it. We don't even need the statements of the Vice President or the Secretary of State to prove that. The evidence on the ground is obvious and clear. There's no question about it. They are still working on nuclear weaponry. And it does appear that a lot of people right now are talking about this very development and the facts that have been presented from the ground over the past several weeks and the statements that have been made by official U.S., government officials over the course of the day. And Matthew, what are people thinking about that? Are people thinking that the Iranians have truly restarted their nuclear development program? Or are people thinking that they're still trying to, or that they aren't and they don't even have a nuclear development and research program? And what are you thinking about that as well?
Okay, so it looks like 68% of the audience said Iran really has restarted their nuclear weapons program, as the U.S. is claiming, while 17% said the U.S. is simply trying to manufacture a war consent by making this information up on the spot, and 10% said there's some truth to the claim, but it's not completely true. So here's one thing that I've seen many people in the chat pointing out. Iran never stopped developing nuclear weapons. There's been zero evidence out there showing that Iran ever stopped, just because during Midnight Hammer we saw the B-2 bombers strike those nuclear sites. That does not mean that brought the program to a stop. The U.S. tried to claim that there was significant damage to the facilities, but I don't think they ever said that the nuclear program was ever over. Also, they could not account for all the nuclear enrichment material that was already sitting there in the basements of these locations. They weren't really sure where that material even went. So that was a major problem. So I would say that Iran really has restarted the program. And when I say restarted, I mean they've started rebuilding the facilities that were damaged before. They have started to rebuild those and expand them as well. Right now, the main site that we're seeing that has been expanded is Pickaxe Mountain, which was not struck, by the way, during Midnight Hammer. It was completely ignored for the most part and was allowed to exist, which some people say was maybe an intentional oversight. Some people say maybe it was incompetence. Nobody's really sure. But for whatever reason, the B-2s did not hit that site. And that appears to be priority target number one this time around, because that appears to be the most pertinent site that we're seeing right now that's still operating. And that's the site that's currently expanding that we can see from satellite. So I don't think the U.S. is trying to manufacture war consent. They are truthfully saying that the program has restarted, and truthfully, it never really ended. But Enforcer, what say you?
And also, I have to make a correction. A big shout out to RC Menace who put this in. It's actually the GBU 57 mop, not the GBU 54, which is what I stated earlier. Correction on that and a retraction of the statement. But outside of that, I would actually have to say, addressing this poll, that my opinion is that they never stopped the nuclear research and development programs. It was generally a misstatement by the U.S. government, if I was to put it that way, or more so the ego kind of catching up to a specific person where they couldn't just, admit that it didn't really achieve the sorts of results they were looking for, because it was stated by the U.S. government last year, when Midnight Hammer was conducted, that the Iranian nuclear program was completely destroyed. And when any other intelligence agency from France or from Israel or from any other Middle Eastern country or any other government would come out and say, hey, it doesn't really appear so, it appears that there was some moderate damage, but it didn't completely knock out their research program, a specific person within the U.S. government would absolutely go mental and lose it by saying that these people are haters and they don't want to admit that it was such a great operation, I'm the greatest person alive, and so on and so forth. We generally already knew back then, and we even knew it on the channel and we're saying it, that the Iranian nuclear research and weapons development program had never ceased. It had been damaged quite significantly, that is true, and the Qom uranium enrichment plant, from what we know, was put out of action for some time and may still be out of action now. But the other key facilities, like the Isfahan Nuclear Research Campus, generally appears to still be operational at the moment, and the scientists that operated at this facility are generally still alive and still working on the nuclear program. And more importantly, out of the two uranium enrichment plants that the Islamic Republic of Iran had, which was Qom and Isfahan, or more so the Natanz facility, only one of them has been knocked out of operation. This one right here is still operating, and they do not need a entire two uranium enrichment plants to be able to produce a nuclear weapon. It's going to take a lot longer to get the fissile material necessary to create a nuclear bomb with only one enrichment plant, but it is still definitely doable. And the fact that this facility was never hit lets us know that they've been enriching uranium still at a weapons grade this entire time. As long as they have some sort of access to uranium and ore, which we would assume they still do, they still have the ability to enrich it at the Pickaxe Mountain facility. It's never been damaged and it's never been hit.
Also, I have to bring this up is we had this debate back when Midnight Hammer happened last year. We had this debate then as well. I still have no idea, truthfully, why they did not strike a Pickaxe Mountain. Some people had speculated back then when we saw this happening that they did not strike it, that maybe the U.S. didn't know about Pickaxe Mountain, or somehow there was maybe an oversight that led them to sort of ignore the situation. We still don't know to this day. There's never been an official acknowledgement of why they did not hit the site, which is extremely strange to me, because I would assume that our intelligence has mapped out pretty much all of these sites previously before they started striking last year or mid last year in the summer. They probably knew about it. So, it's like, why didn't they hit it? It's like this was one of the most crucial spots that they're currently enriching at, and we didn't hit it. Also, by the way, we're still seeing they are burying the entrances to, like, for example, Isfahan and the other nuclear sites. For those to be allegedly destroyed, why is Iran burying the entrances to them like they're still operational? And we're still not very clear if they've actually been destroyed or not. So there's a lot of loose ends with this situation right now. So it's about time the U.S. makes a second pass, and hopefully this time it's a comprehensive pass and not just a half-ass attempt like we saw last time.
I'll be entirely honest with y'all. I don't really think a second pass directly on the nuclear facilities is going to achieve the aims that we're looking for. The fact that the MOPS generally damaged a comb but didn't knock it out entirely gives us an idea that trying to use a similar bomb on the Pickaxe Mountain facility will probably produce similar results to where the facility will be damaged, but it could be brought back up to an operational capacity at some point in the future. I think it's fairly evident at this point that a U.S. military operation against Iran needs not focus on the nuclear facilities, at least at the moment right now. Generally interdicting any normal day-to-day operations would be optimal once military operations begin, but I think our high priority needs to be the dismantlement of the Islamic Republic's government, which is the one which is continuing to push forward this nuclear research and development in the form of trying to create a usable nuclear weapon. I think that's probably going to be our best move, because if the Islamic Republic's government continues to exist, they are going to continue to develop a nuclear weapon. It doesn't matter how many of the facilities that we destroy. Once we give them a couple of years to sit around and let the dust settle, they're going to start rebuilding these facilities once over again. They're going to start trying to gather up centrifuges once more to go and put into deeper facilities that are even farther underground that might be impossible for us to reach. They're going to try and heighten their security around these facilities. They're going to try and make them even more secret, even harder to detect by satellite, and so on. So I would say that, in my honest opinion, folks, I think that the best thing to do here is not to go, at least when we're striking this nation here soon, not after the uranium enrichment facilities and the direct ground base that they use to operate their nuclear research and development programs. I think this time we need to go after the Iranian conventional forces that protect the Iranian government, and then directly at the Iranian government itself. Otherwise, we're going to see that if the Islamic Republic continues to exist in the future, they will continue to try and work towards a nuclear weapon, hell or high water. So with that,
Yeah. Also, by the way, something else that doesn't make any sense? I realized there was a discrepancy today when I heard some reports that came out. Remember, during Midnight Hammer, they struck the nuclear sites. Let me know, do you recall it the same way that I do? Did they say that all of the Iranian nuclear enriched uranium was destroyed in those strikes? Did they say that?
yes, they said it had been destroyed and they believed it was in Qom, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay, so I recall hearing that as well. Today, there was a report that came out, which was a major discrepancy. There was a report saying that the U.S. was trying to get Iran to agree to remove all of its enriched uranium from their country and transfer it to a third-party country, so that way Iran wouldn't have possession of it. But the problem is, we were told that it was destroyed during the last strikes. So apparently, they still have enriched uranium, and in fact, they apparently have quite a bit of it, actually, based on the sounds of these reports that we're hearing, which would also suggest that the nuclear sites were not fully destroyed during Midnight Hammer, which I've been speculating for quite some time. So that was something today that caught my attention. So right now, also, by the way, the U.S. government will still not give us a concrete amount of time that Iran has left to actually finish development of a nuclear weapon. They still will not tell the public that. And apparently Iran has material, so they could, I guess, hypothetically build one, or perhaps a dirty bomb, but we're not told exactly how much they have, how long it'll take them to complete development of a nuclear weapons program. They won't tell us any of that stuff, which is kind of fascinating to me, because it's not like that would violate national security, but it would give the public clarity about how dangerous the situation truly is, but they still won't say it.
And also, really quickly, we actually do have some fairly interesting facts to show y'all from way back then. I actually just went and pulled up. This was let's see here. How many days ago would this have been? About 240 days ago that Operation Midnight Hammer happened. And this is the very map that we had on air when those strikes were being conducted. And if you want to see this clearly, folks, here it is. There was all of the markers that we had from Iran at this latter point. This was about the last half of the 12-day war in the Midnight Hammer that was conducted as well. And if I am not mistaken, I believe that we have a little bit of details here that would show, and let me see here if I can find it. I don't think at this point we were generally reposting a lot of government statements, because nowadays we're having a little bit more of a relaxed policy on that, so that way if we need to, we can go back on our maps and reference it later. But we were able to get a report from way back then, from Reuters that is, that stated that U.S. strikes may have set Iran's nuclear program back by only months, according to sources. This was completely opposite of the U.S. government statements, particularly, I believe it was that of the President of the United States, who was going out there and literally going off on people who were making these statements and claims, and stating that the facilities had been completely destroyed, all of the uranium was gone, it was a wild success. I remember this. I remember that journalists were asking at the Pentagon, the Secretary of Defense, they were asking him, well, you know, we hear that it wasn't complete damage, and then he was going off talking about, really, you're talking about this? You know, I'm not talking about the bombers and the pilots that did a 36-hour flight? Come on, are you real? And they were doing all of that. And we all knew back then, I mean, it was quite clear even after the strikes had just been conducted, that the nuclear program had not been completely knocked out. It looked like it had been damaged, but it had not been completely destroyed. And yet the U.S. government, or specifically the office of the president, just went off the concept it was completely destroyed. This will never be a problem again. It was the greatest military operation ever conducted. We're not talking about this anymore, and we're moving on. And now 8 months later, we're right back to it. So it appears that those original statements and assessments from way back then, well, not really statements, well, not really assessments, but more so just the statements from the president were pretty much completely off. I mean, even right now, if those statements were true, they would have stood to be true, and we wouldn't be revisiting the situation 8 months later. I mean, that's quite obvious. Also, let me see. Let's see. Let me see here. I want to go through these markers really quickly. Here we go. Here's actually the statement. Damn. It doesn't exist anymore. It was the statement from the president, and it doesn't exist. Okay, hang on. Let's see. Maybe we have another one. Oh, dang. It doesn't look like we have another one.
And what's the statement? I can retrieve it.
I'm trying to see if we can get the statement from the president where he said everything was completely destroyed. Everyone's just hating on me. You know, everything's done so well, it'll never be a problem again for years. Because he made a statement very similar, directly worded like that, and I cannot find it, at least at the moment. Let's see. Oh, here we go. Here's actually a CIA press release, and here's the statement from the director of the CIA. The CIA can confirm that a body of credible intelligence indicates Iran's nuclear program has been severely damaged by the recent targeted strikes. This includes new intelligence from a historically reliable and accurate source method that several key Iranian nuclear facilities were destroyed and would have to be rebuilt over the course of years. And that's largely restating exactly what the President of the United States stated in his own social media statements right here, is that the facilities were destroyed. They weren't heavily damaged or moderately damaged. They were flat out destroyed, and they'd have to be rebuilt over years. And I want to put that out there to folks. It's only 8 months later. It's not even been close to years. It's only been 8 months, and we're now saying that they've restarted uranium enrichment and that they're working towards a nuclear weapon once again. So clearly, all of the original statements from the office of the president 8 months ago were markedly untrue, considering the fact that we're not years down the road revisiting the situation. We're only months down the road, and now we're revisiting the situation. CIA continues to collect additional reliably sourced information to keep appropriate decision makers and oversight bodies fully informed. When possible, we will also provide updates and information to the American public, given the national importance of this matter, in every attempt to provide transparency. So it is quite clear that from these statements alone from the CIA, they were largely repeating the statements of the president. The facilities have been completely destroyed. It'll take years to rebuild them. 8 months later, they're restarting the nuclear program.
I have it right here, by the way. I was putting the likes tab right here. It was back on September 23rd, 2025 when this post was made. The quote was, that the B-2s hit the facilities, Iran's key nuclear facilities, totally obliterating everything. That was the statement. So I remember hearing that multiple times, by the way. I think there was also maybe a Truth Social post out there somewhere that said that. I don't see that right off the bat, but apparently there was a lot of statements made along those lines.
So here's a couple of those statements for direct quotes. Sadly, we can't play the videos, but we could read you all the direct quotes. Today, many of Iran's former military commanders, in fact, are no longer with us. They're dead. 3 months ago, when Operation Midnight Hammer, let's see. When Operation Midnight Hammer, 7 American B-2 bombers dropped the 14 30,000-pound each bombs on Iran's key nuclear facilities, totally obliterating everything, meaning that there would be no nuclear program left. Then this was an additional statement from the President of the United States once again. The United States destroyed Iran's nuclear enrichment capability, and Operation Midnight Hammer was one of the most successful operations anyone has ever seen. And that's a direct quote from the president. And 8 months ago, right after this operation was concluded, the president was saying that it completely destroyed Iran's nuclear enrichment capability. I mean, that's literally his own words. So based off of these statements, we would assume that the Iranian nuclear issue would not be an issue again. But all the intelligence that we had showed that it was still going to be an issue because it hadn't completely destroyed the facility. So, now we're having to come back around to this again, and it's still an issue, which we were saying back then. Much to the dismay of any who stated that we were trying to hate on the president, because, if you ever say that something didn't go well with the current president, you're clearly a hater, instead of just looking at the actual facts and saying it should have been a multi-week-long strike to tear down the Iranian government and their nuclear program. But nevertheless, that appears to be the case today. But I want to make sure to go back and get the direct words and statements from the President of the United States, just so that way if people are about to say right now that we're lying and that the President never said that, these are his direct words. And going off of those direct words, we shouldn't even be revisiting this issue right now, yet we are. But with that, it is time for us to move on into another poll, because a lot of people are actually starting to talk about how Iran has reportedly offered at Geneva, Switzerland, to reduce nuclear enrichment to minimal levels. But we've also heard from other governmental sources, including the United States president, that they have also never agreed to completely stop on the development of a nuclear weapon. And no matter what negotiation or meeting has been held, they have never accepted that demand. And a lot of people are wondering, will the U.S. consider this Iranian proposal to limit enrichment but not completely knock out their nuclear weapons program? And what are people thinking about that, Matthew? And what are people thinking about that? And what are you thinking about that right now, actually?
Okay, so Iran has reportedly delivered an offer to the Omani, apparently negotiators, on behalf of the United States officials that is apparently offering to reduce nuclear enrichment down to like 3%, which is pretty minimal considering what Iran's currently doing with nuclear enrichment. So will the U.S. consider this, or what's your take? 66% said no, the U.S. has already decided to strike and the cards are pretty much set. 20% said yes, the U.S. will consider the new offer and maybe try to make a deal, and 10% said I'm 50-50 on this one. And at this point, I think the U.S. has pretty much stacked the cards against Iran. It seems like to me, they have already put a plan into motion to strike Iran, and the talks are simply to buy more time and make the Iranians believe that maybe there's a hope on the horizon of some type of resolution, but I think that chance is long over at this point. There are too many things that are lining up against Iran. Number one, we've seen all the embassies in the area that are at risk, they've evacuated. We've also seen the Bahrain naval port evacuated as well. We've also seen, for the first time ever, fighter jets stationed inside of Israel, and also non-stop flights going back and forth from the United States to the Middle East for the past couple of months. So between all of that, and also, by the way, not to mention, we have like 30% of our naval forces in the Middle East right now, which is insane, and who knows how much of Air Force forces are currently there. We don't have that number right offhand, but it's quite a lot. You can see that from the satellite images. So I think the U.S. has decided to strike. It's pretty much over with at this point, and Iran knows it's coming, and Iran's preparing for the worst. Like, they're wiring money out, they're trying to put the oil on the ships and evacuate their oil. They are preparing for a doomsday scenario. So I'm with the 65%. Talks are just a waste at this point. But Enforcer, what say you?
I'd have to say that I would be with the 65%. The U.S. has clearly decided to strike. Midnight Hammer did not achieve what it was supposed to. We already knew that 8 months ago. And I mean, like, if you don't believe us on that, you can go back to our streams from 8 months ago, right after Midnight Hammer, literally the days that followed, and we were making it incredibly clear that we were going to have to revisit this because the operation was too short, it didn't achieve enough, and we needed to achieve a far great deal more with a multi-week long air operation. As a matter of fact, that was even known back then. That's the crazy thing about this, folks, is that we were literally talking about back then that there was an argument in the military, specifically within the Department of Defense, about conducting a one-night-long airstrike against Iran or a multi-week long airstrike against Iran, and we were in the camp that it would have to be multiple weeks long to be able to deal with the problem accordingly, because you have to be thorough. We're not trying to rob a bank here. You're not trying to run in and be in and out in 30 minutes. We're trying to literally topple an entire government in a foreign country and completely obliterate their nuclear research and weapons program. So with that in mind, it's clearly going to take weeks. So, with that in mind, we're clearly going to have to do this over again. Midnight Hammer did not achieve what it was supposed to achieve. It was a wildly impressive operation from a visual perspective, but much like the operation to capture Maduro, it does not achieve the U.S. foreign policy's aims by conducting a one-and-done operation that happens within a couple of hours. These operations take weeks, maybe even months, and we'll have to see that we go into this again and that we conduct these military actions again. And it's quite clear that they've already made that decision, thankfully, because we can see that around a quarter of the entire combat aviation power of the U.S. Air Force is currently within the Middle East, and about a third of the deployed Navy is within the Middle East as well. So quite obviously, at this point, they are already going to be conducting strikes. We do not move that many forces into an area and strategically deprive ourselves in other theaters to do absolutely nothing. This right now with the Iranians is to basically see if there's a last slim chance of a hope that the Iranians will just agree to everything that we ask for before we bomb them, but the reality is that they're not, and we're going to bomb them anyways. So with that in mind, I would have to be well within the 65%. Strikes are going to be coming no matter what happens with the Iranian proposal that's been issued via an Omani, I guess you could say, emissary or a messenger that has already been provided to the U.S. as of today. But with that, we do have to move into some other more important news around the area as well. Not only speaking of the rearmament of the Iranian nuclear program, where it's restarting officially according to U.S. government statements today, but also all the other developments that have happened around the Middle East. We were able to see that within the capital of Iran, there's been some fairly interesting sorts of developments. For one, Iran has stated that there will be fierce retaliation if the U.S. attacks. This has apparently led to some U.S. analysts actually claiming that the Israelis should be the ones to bomb Iran first, as we also were able to hear that senior advisors of the president stated that they would prefer that Israel carries out the initial strikes on Iran. So it appears that some U.S. officials want the Israelis to actually lead the charge and bomb Iran first, and then the United States is just going to join in on it. And I've got to say, I'm generally against that idea because that phrases this entire operation as basically helping out Israel. This is like, I don't mean to make this clear multiple times on air over weeks, but this isn't really about Israel. They'll be helped out by this, sure, but this is about U.S. national security interests. I don't know why in the world the Israelis are going to lead the charge for our own national security interests, in the interests of our own nation and our own citizenry. If the Israelis want to join us at 0 hour when we're bombing Iran and bomb them at the same time, they can be our guests. We'd be more than happy for that. But this is a U.S.-led military operation to secure U.S. military interests, and I'll be entirely honest with y'all, just from the optics of it alone, I don't really like the Israelis leading the charge on the behalf of the U.S.'s own interests against a sworn enemy of the United States. That would be my honest opinion. I think that the U.S. should be the one leading the charge first and foremost. This is a national security issue that concerns the United States of America and Israel, but we're approaching this from the perspective that the United States of America is the key issue and the key point that we're trying to defend, us being Americans. So for that reason, we should lead the charge. But outside of that, we've also been able to hear some other interesting developments coming out of the Islamic Republic of Iran, because they're getting fairly concerned that strikes are coming very soon. Incredibly soon, as a matter of fact. And it appears that Khamenei has already taken all available precautions and measures that he can to try and guarantee, or at least hedge his bets towards his own survival. Many of y'all will know that foreign leaders that generally get on the U.S.'s target really don't end up staying around too long. They either get grabbed in the night by the boogeyman, or they end up getting hit by a bomb. It's one or the other. And right now, Khamenei's trying to avoid getting grabbed by the boogeyman or getting bombed in the middle of the night. So apparently, Khamenei has already moved to a secure bunker within an undisclosed location, highly likely within Tehran and highly likely within the Lavazan neighborhood, if we're being entirely honest. He has a massive bunker complex in Lavazan that we know of, but it might be another bunker somewhere else in Iran that would be a little less predictable. But considering that Maduro was literally hanging out at basically the Ministry of Defense when he was nabbed, I'd say it's highly likely that Khamenei is also hanging out in somewhere that would seem to be a little bit more familiar and more comfortable, which is probably in the Lavazan neighborhood in Tehran. But apparently, right now, he's so worried about anyone giving away where he's at to the United States intelligence and getting bombed that every single government official right now that goes to speak to him has to be grabbed by his bodyguards, blindfolded, put in the back of a van. I would assume that's completely blacked out as far as visibility, where they can't look out and see anything, even if the blindfold isn't entirely sound. They then bring him into the bunker, walk him up to Khamenei, and then sit him down in a chair, and then he conducts the meeting the entire time with a blindfold on. Then they grab the guy, put him back in the van, the whole time with the blindfold on, and then drive him out and drop him off wherever he came from, and then they take the blindfold off of him. That way they cannot figure out where in the hell Khamenei is exactly. And that actually came out today in this statement right here. Ayatollah Khamenei has been moved to hiding, and the Iranian regime officials are taken to meet with him blindfolded to prevent his hiding place from being revealed, according to a statement from Iran International. So it appears that the
So who's the driver, by the way? Obviously they're not blindfolding the driver, otherwise he could be like a good candidate for maybe like an F1 race driver or something. But it's like, the driver is going to know where he's going. So there's a possible weak point right there. The driver could snitch, that's bringing the people to the Ayatollah. So that's one thing. But also, by the way, it's like, there's other ways to track. Like, I'm sure the Iranians aren't doing extremely strong sweeps. Like, they could have a tracking device in their shoe, like embedded in the sole. There are plenty of ways to track where these guys are going to meet Khamenei. Plenty of ways to still do it. Also, by the way, they can simply do satellite reconnaissance and see where the vehicle simply went, or perhaps a drone overhead. A stealth drone could be tracking that vehicle. So that's not going to prevent anything. By the way, I'm sure we still have a fix on where that guy's at, even with these precautions.
Well, we certainly do. Just from satellite footage alone and satellite photography, we would be able to tell where he is because of the heavy presence of bodyguards and other support staff that are outside the bunker or continuously driving in and out of the bunker that he's in. Another thing that's a little bit important to note, though, is that the reason why the driver and the bodyguards don't have to wear any sort of blindfolds and they are able to pretty much operate freely is because they are a part of Khamenei's personal bodyguard. So these are basically the most die-hard, most loyal bodyguards that they can find. They'll, in theory, lay down their lives for Khamenei without a second thought. So that's generally why they're the ones trusted to basically ferry top officials to Khamenei and from Khamenei without wearing any kind of blindfolds, because it's expected that they're going to be, for one, always in close proximity to Khamenei, so being able to rat him out would be fairly slim, because they rarely ever get a chance to get far enough away and alone to be able to talk to anyone who may be an agent of the CIA or the Mossad. And then secondly, the other thing is that generally they do have to have some sort of operations to where someone has to know where he is. So that's also the reason why they're not wearing blindfolds. But it can be a weak point. We could most likely find out where they are just based off of this. And also on top of that, if he's speaking to a great deal of government officials, that means that there has to be a decent amount of cars that are driving in and out of this bunker facility. And then we just have to follow where in the world the most government transports are being made to what specific endpoint, and then that's where the bunker is, and it's as easy as that.
And also, by the way, like, this isn't a conspiracy theory. This was happening over Venezuela for quite some time, and Venezuela's government never knew about it. The U.S. was flying stealth surveillance drones over Venezuelan airspace for at least a month prior to the exfiltration of Maduro himself from the palace. So they couldn't even detect the drones, and we were doing surveillance on them for ages, and they had no idea. I'm sure that the same thing's probably happening in Iran as well, and that's probably how we're going to track them. Also, by the way, these guys who are drivers and also these government officials, I'm sure that they probably confiscate their cell phone, but if anybody has any method of communication on them, even a pager or anything of that nature, then there's a way to track that all the way back to Khamenei's bunker. So there are plenty of ways to figure out where Khamenei's at. So I don't think for a second that it's that anybody's confused about where he's hiding out. And there's also probably sources on the ground that are probably snitching here and there as well, that are feeding more clues to intelligence. So it's really honestly pointless, but really.
It is quite pointless, but they're trying their best. As far as the Iranians can, which they're fairly incompetent, at least in the government, they're trying their best. But moving on from that, we've also been able to hear that they're trying to hedge the financial markets as best as they can as well. We've been able to hear that they're giving everyone free oil on the house down in the Gulf. Apparently, Iran is loading almost 3 times the normal amount of oil onto its tankers in the Persian Gulf in a sign it is anticipating a U.S. attack, according to Bloomberg. This is giving us an idea they're trying to get a little bit of extra money before things go badly by getting it out quicker. And that's going to be a little bit interesting because it makes me wonder, are we about to start seizing all of these tankers once they make it out of the Strait of Hormuz and into the Gulf of Oman? Are we just going to start grabbing up all of these ships? Because I don't believe many of them have left port yet. It's just that a load of them are getting loaded faster than normal. So we'll have to see what happens with that. I also got to say, really quickly, I saw someone in the chat earlier saying that it's probably one of these very tankers that's carrying a nuclear weapon that the Iranians have made. Here's the catch about that. Iran will never be able to get a tanker of theirs into a U.S. port. It would get seized about 20 miles off the coast, or even farther than that, about 100 miles out, by the U.S. Coast Guard or the U.S. Navy before it ever even arrived to a U.S. port to detonate, so that would never happen. So that sort of a thing would be, for one, generally fictitious because it just would never be able to happen. An Iranian sanctioned tanker is not going to pull up into a U.S. port and just, moor at anchor and be perfectly fine and no one's going to mess with it because it's an Iranian sanctioned tanker. And secondly, on top of that, there really is no way that the Iranians could load a nuclear weapon onto one of these ships because they don't even have one yet. I mean, they're still working on one, but they certainly do not have a nuclear weapon yet. We've also been able to see, though, moving on out of this news in Iran and back towards Israel, that there is a decent amount of U.S. air presence inside of Israel. We were able to see at Tel Aviv that there is a decent amount of KC-135s still on the ramp. Actually, okay, those are KC-135s. The engine intake over there on the other wing made it look like the nose cone was a lot more stocky, and it made me think for a second. I was like, wait a minute, are those rivet joints or something else along those lines? I was like, nah, those aren't it. Those are KC-135s. But they are based directly out of the Tel Aviv International Airport, as we can see in this clip, and it does appear to be showing us the United States Air Force is conducting direct operations right out of Tel Aviv. Additionally, we also were able to hear that KLM is going to be suspending all flights to Tel Aviv starting on the 1st of March due to regional tensions, which does appear to be showing us that they may have gotten some information from the Dutch government that strikes will probably be coming around soon. Avoid flying to the area. We've also been able to hear way south inside of Israel, and I mean as south as it can get, all the way down here at the Avda Air Base, which is this air base right here, which is an Israeli facility. Oh, very well equipped one, I will add. Let me show y'all some of the facilities here. For one, they have these really nice hardened shelters that they use to house their aircraft. That's actually pretty high end, I'm not going to lie. Like, the U.S. doesn't even really have this in most places, but the Israelis do. I mean, wow, that's a lot of money. That's a lot of money right there. Well, look at that. More of them. I mean, they can actually protect most of their aircraft from a direct attack here at Avda Base. Now, that's a little bit different than Nevatim, which is usually the one that we're always talking about within southern Israel. Let me get you all up here to Nevatim really quickly. Here it is. This one usually, well, actually normally has above-ground facilities like these right here, but the Avda facility actually has protected bunker facilities, which is fairly rare even for Israel. And we can also see a little graveyard that they have over here for the older aircraft that they no longer use. But getting us back down into Avda down here, it does appear here that the U.S. Air Force's F-22s actually landed at the Avda Air Base, and we've now been able to hear that apparently it seems that the Israelis have given one of the runways a brand new tarmac.
Now that's interesting, isn't it?
That is interesting. Why in the world would they do that, folks? That's something interesting. Matthew, what do you think they would do that for? I don't even have the answer for this. It appears to be a resurfacing, though, and what do you think they're doing this for?
I would guess that way the U.S. probably has a spot to base our fighter jets out of, or we can use this as a temporary landing spot if we need to land some fighter jets, service them, or do whatever we need to do to it. It's probably for that reason, for U.S. support.
But the thing is, though, is that these runways were operational even right now, like very recently. You can even see the skid marks and tire marks from the Israeli aircraft that are almost constantly taking off and landing on this airstrip on both runways. So it clearly has been used. up until now. And that's actually the question that I have. It's not like they're trying to make this base operational for the U.S. It was operational, and that makes me wonder, why in the world did they resurface it? And there was a couple of reasons that I could think of, but I don't really know which one it would be. They might have resurfaced it because the F-22's landing gear are fairly fragile, which is something that we actually kind of believe a little bit may be the case. And generally, F-22s have to be landed with a great deal of care from what we've seen in every clip that we've seen of them so far. So they may have resurfaced it to give a smoother landing surface just to the F-22s. By the way, Israel doesn't have any F-22s, so this would be a fairly new thing for an F-22 to show up in Israel. Another thing that they could have done this for is that they could have resurfaced the runway to maybe give it a little bit of additional structural integrity, so that way the